The sound of history fracturing is not always the thunder of a cannonade, but the sickening, splintering crunch of a heavy axe biting deep into seasoned oak. In the smoke-choked air of a Belgian afternoon, at precisely 12:30 on the 18th of June, 1815, the destiny of the entire civilized world hung not upon the grand maneuvers of emperors, but upon the straining hinges of a single wooden gate. It is a moment of such singular, terrifying importance that it has been etched into the very soul of the British Army, a moment where the fate of nations rested on the muscle and sinew of a handful of men. Before we step into the fire to witness this impossible stand, I invite you to subscribe and join our ranks, ensuring that these stories of courage, sacrifice, and forgotten valor are never lost to the fog of time. To understand the sheer terror of this moment, one must strip away the romantic paintings of the era, forget the neat lines and the polite generals. At the north gate of the Chateau of Hougoumont, there was only a claustrophobic, deafening maelstrom of violence. Outside the walls, the French army swirled like a rising tide, thousands of blue-coated infantrymen surging forward with the fanaticism of men who believed their emperor was a god of war returned to earth. They were not merely attacking a farmhouse, they were attempting to break the spine of the Duke of Wellington's army, and leading them was a nightmare made flesh. Looming out of the gunsmoke came the sappers, the combat pioneers of the French 1st Light Infantry. These were not fresh conscripts. They were giants of men, chosen for their immense physical strength and savage demeanor. In their hands they did not carry muskets, but massive felling axes, tools designed to clear forests and shatter fortifications. At their head was Sous-Lieutenant Legros, a man known to his troops as the Enforcer, a colossal figure who wielded his axe with the ferocity of a butcher. The British defenders inside the courtyard, the Coldstream Guards, could hear them before they saw them. The heavy thud of iron striking timber echoed through the courtyard, louder than the screams of the wounded, louder even than the rattle of musketry from the walls. The north gate, the only lifeline for ammunition and reinforcements, was under siege. This gate was never meant to be a fortress. It was a simple entrance for farm carts, sturdy perhaps, but not built to withstand the fury of Legros and his giants. With a final, catastrophic groan of tearing wood, the crossbar gave way. The heavy panels swung open, not by the will of the defenders, but forced by the sheer, brute strength of the French pioneers. Time, in that instant, seemed to freeze. To the casual observer, it was merely a broken door in a burning farm complex. But to the military historian, and indeed to the Duke of Wellington watching anxiously from the ridge above, it was the beginning of the end. If we pause the clock here with the gate yawning open and Legros stepping over the threshold, we can see the dominoes of disaster beginning to fall with terrifying clarity. If the north gate remains open, the French infantry pours into the courtyard in unchecked numbers. The Coldstream Guards, elite as they are, will be overwhelmed by sheer mass. If the courtyard is taken, the Chateau of Hougoumont falls. This farmhouse was the breakwater, the anchor protecting Wellington's right flank. If the anchor drags, the line collapses. The British right would be rolled up like a wet carpet. Wellington would be forced to retreat, likely in disorder, towards the coast. The Prussian army, marching to his aid, would arrive to find nothing but a routed field. Napoleon Bonaparte, the ogre of Europe, would be master of Brussels by nightfall and master of the continent within a month. All of this, the future of the British Empire, the peace of Europe, the safety of millions back home in England, stared through that open gate. It was a gaping wound in the British defense, and through it marched the invincible spirit of the Grande Armée. The French surged forward, sensing blood. They spilled into the courtyard, a flood of blue uniforms, bayonets gleaming in the chaotic light. A roar of triumph went up from the attackers. They had done the impossible. They had breached the fortress. For the British soldiers inside, the sight must have been paralyzing. The Coldstreamers were trained for order, for volley fire, for the rigid discipline of the square. They were not prepared for a medieval brawl against axe-wielding giants in their own rear. Panic, that most contagious of battlefield diseases, should have taken hold in almost every other engagement of the Napoleonic Wars. Once a fortified position is breached, the morale of the defenders shatters like glass. It is the psychological breaking point. To see the enemy inside your walls is to know that you are already dead. By all the laws of war, the garrison should have thrown down their arms or fled into the burning ruins of the stables. But these were not ordinary men. These were His Majesty's Coldstream Regiment of Foot Guards. Their motto was Nulli Secunda, second to none. They were the oldest regiment in the army, men who traced their lineage back to the Restoration, men who drilled with a precision that bordered on the mechanical. Yet in this moment, drill manuals were useless. No officer could shout a command over the din. No formation could be adopted in the swirling melee. It came down to instinct. It came down to a realization that flashed through the mind of the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell, a man of Scottish granite who stood amidst the chaos. He saw the gate, he saw the French pouring in, and he knew with a clarity that cuts through the fog of war that if that gate was not closed physically, brutally, immediately, then England was lost. There was no time for a strategy meeting. There was no time to call for reserves. There was only the open door, the rushing enemy, and the terrifying knowledge that they were outnumbered 30-1. Macdonell did not fire his pistol. He did not shout for a retreat. He lowered his shoulder, roared a challenge that was less a command and more a primal scream, and charged directly at the onrushing tide of French infantry. This was the precipice. This was the moment where the impossible became necessary. As Legros raised his axe to widen the breach and usher in the destruction of Wellington's army, he was met not by a surrender, but by a wall of red wool and iron determination. The collision that followed would determine the course of the 19th century. But to understand how a handful of men could summon the strength to defy an empire, we must first look back. We must understand the shadow that had fallen across Europe and the terrifying reputation of the man who had returned from exile to set the world aflame once more. Comprehend the ferocity of the struggle at Hougoumont, one must first appreciate the paralyzing dread that had gripped the heart of Europe in the spring of 1850. It was a fear so profound, so visceral, that it transcended borders and languages, chilling the blood of kings in Vienna and simple shopkeepers in London alike. The world believed the nightmare was over. The great tyrant Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated, abdicated, and exiled to the Rock of Elba. The monarchs of Europe had gathered in Austria to carve up the map of a post-Napoleonic world, dancing at balls and celebrating the restoration of the old order. Peace, it seemed, had finally descended upon a continent bled dry by 2 decades of constant war. But peace was a fragile illusion. In March, a courier arrived at the Congress of Vienna with news that silenced the orchestras and turned the faces of diplomats ashen. The eagle had flown. Napoleon had escaped. He had landed in France with a handful of guards, and the impossible had happened. The armies sent to arrest him, upon seeing that familiar small figure in the grey greatcoat, had not fired. They had wept. They had thrown down their royalist cockades and embraced him, crying, "Vive l'Empereur!" The Bourbon king, Louis XVII, so recently restored to the throne by British bayonets, fled Paris in the middle of the night. In the span of 20 days, without firing a single shot, Napoleon had reconquered France. To the modern mind, it is difficult to grasp the supernatural aura that surrounded this man. To the British public of 1815, Boney was not merely a foreign general. He was the ogre, a seemingly invincible force of nature who had toppled empires and rewritten the laws of reality. Mothers in the home counties had spent years frightening their children into obedience with the whisper that Boney is coming. Now, the nursery rhyme had become a terrifying reality. The spectre of a French invasion, of the tricolour flying over the Tower of London, returned with a vengeance. The stock market panicked. The government scrambled. It was felt with a heavy certainty that the great work of the previous 20 years was undone. The coalition of European powers, Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, immediately declared war. But not against France. In a document of chilling legal precision, they declared war on one man, Napoleon Bonaparte himself. They branded him an outlaw, an enemy of humanity, to be hunted down and destroyed. Yet, declarations do not fight battles. As the Allied armies slowly mobilized their lumbering giants in the east, Napoleon moved with the terrifying speed that was his hallmark. He knew he could not fight the whole world at once. His only chance, his desperate gamble, was to strike quickly to smash the British and Prussians in Belgium before the Austrians and Russians could arrive. And so, the storm clouds gathered over the fields of Flanders. But the British army standing in his path was not the Iron Legion that had marched victorious through Spain. The Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, arrived in Brussels to find a situation that would have broken a lesser commander. His invincible peninsular veterans, the men who had bested the French marshals time and again, were largely absent. Many had been shipped across the Atlantic to fight in the war against the United States. In their place, Wellington found himself commanding what he privately described as an infamous army. It was a motley collection of disparities. He had raw British recruits, plowboys and factory workers who had never heard a shot fired in anger and scarcely knew how to form a line. He had Dutch and Belgian troops, men who had only months prior been fighting for Napoleon and whose loyalty was suspect at best. He had contingents from Hanover and Brunswick, brave but ill-equipped. It was a patchwork force, glued together by nothing more than the reputation of its commander and the stiffening spine of a few elite British regiments. Opposing them was the Armée du Nord. If Wellington's force was a ragtag militia, Napoleon's army was a weapon of pure, distilled vengeance. These were not conscripts dragged unwillingly from their farms. These were the grognards, the grumblers. They were veterans of Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram. They were men who had marched to Moscow and back, men who had seen the fires of hell and survived. They had rallied to Napoleon's banner not out of duty, but out of fanaticism. They believed they had been betrayed by their generals in 1814, and they burned with a fierce desire to wash away the humiliation of the Bourbon Restoration in British blood. The French army in 1815 was perhaps the most dangerous fighting force Napoleon ever commanded. It was smaller than the great hosts of the past, but it was brittle, angry, and desperate. They knew this was the final throw of the dice. There would be no second chances, no comfortable exiles. For the French soldier, this was victory or death. They looked across the border at the gathering Allied forces with a predatory hunger, eager to shatter the sepoy General Wellington and drive the English into the sea. The strategic reality for Britain was dire. Wellington knew that his infamous army was the only thing standing between Napoleon and the consolidation of his power. If the British were defeated in Belgium, the coalition would likely fracture. The minor German states would sue for peace. The British government, facing bankruptcy and civil unrest, might fall. Europe would plunge back into a dark age of Napoleonic tyranny, a dictatorship enforced by the bayonet and the cannon. The liberty of the continent, the independence of nations, and the security of the British Isles themselves hung by a thread. The atmosphere in Brussels in those early days of June was a strange mixture of gaiety and doom. The Duchess of Richmond's famous ball was planned. Officers danced and drank champagne, but beneath the veneer of social pleasantries lay a cold current of dread. Everyone knew the ogre was coming. Everyone knew that when the collision came, it would be titanic. The sheer disparity in quality between the two armies was the talk of the mess halls. How could raw boys from the shires stand against the Imperial Guard? How could a polyglot force of uncertain loyalty hold the line against the masters of maneuver? Wellington, the supreme realist, understood the mathematics of the butcher's bill better than anyone. He knew he could not match Napoleon in maneuver. His army was too inexperienced to march and countermarch against the French virtuosos. He had to force Napoleon to come to him. He had to find a piece of ground, dig his heels in, and invite the French to smash themselves to pieces against a wall of fire and steel. He needed to turn the battle into a bludgeoning match, a contest of sheer endurance where discipline counted for more than brilliance. But for such a strategy to work, he needed anchors. He needed points on the battlefield that could not, must not be taken. He needed men who would stand and die rather than take a backward step. He needed soldiers who possessed a discipline so rigid, so archaic, that it overrode the natural human instinct for self-preservation. He could not trust the raw militia with this task. He could not trust the uncertain allies. He needed the old breed. As the intelligence reports filtered in, confirming that the French were crossing the frontier, that the charcoal burners were lighting the fires of war, Wellington looked to his order of battle. He needed a rock upon which the French wave would break. He needed the finest infantry in the world, and his finger traced the line to the 2nd Brigade of Guards, specifically to a regiment that had never known defeat, a regiment that carried the cold pride of the border country in its veins. He looked to the Coldstream. The stage was set for a collision of eras. On one side, the revolutionary fervor and tactical genius of the French Empire. On the other, the stubborn, immovable conservatism of the British aristocracy and the stoic endurance of the British soldier. The world held its breath, waiting for the first cannon to roar, waiting to see if the Iron Duke's gamble would pay off, or if the ogre would feast on the bones of another army. But before the first musket could be loaded, we must meet the men who would bear the crushing weight of this responsibility. We must understand the peculiar alchemy that created the Coldstream Guards, to find the men capable of stopping a French avalanche. The Duke of Wellington did not look to the brave but inexperienced boys of the shire regiments, nor to the cavalry with their dashing plumes and reckless courage. He looked to the household division. He looked to the men who guarded the king's person, the Praetorian Guard of the British nation, and specifically he looked to the Coldstream Guards. There is a peculiar arrogance in the Coldstream, a sentiment codified in their very motto, nulli secundus, second to none. It is a motto born of a historical technicality that they have worn like a suit of armor for nearly 4 centuries. Though the Grenadier Guards are ranked first in the army list, the Coldstream is the older regiment, formed by General Monk in 1650. They have never forgiven the slight of being placed second in precedence. And so they adopted the motto to remind the world and their grenadier rivals that while they may march second, they bow to no man. When in 1815, this was not merely a slogan, it was a religion. The men of the Coldstream were a breed apart. To stand in their ranks, one had to be physically imposing. While the average infantryman of the line might be undernourished or stunted by the poverty of the industrial cities, the Guards recruited for size and strength. They were giants in scarlet, chosen to intimidate as much as to fight. But it was not their height that made them dangerous, it was their silence. The discipline of the Coldstream was legendary, bordering on the inhuman. In an era where soldiers were often considered the scum of the earth by their own commanders, kept in line only by the fear of the cat o' nine tails, the Guards operated on a different frequency. They possessed a chilling, mechanical professionalism. They were drilled until the loading of a musket, the fixing of a bayonet, and the formation of a square were not conscious actions but autonomic reflexes. A Coldstreamer did not need to think, he needed only to obey. This suppression of the individual self in favor of the collective machine was exactly what was required for the butcher's yard that Hougoumont was destined to become. But a regiment is only as good as the men who lead it and the men who form its spine. And in the defense of the farm, history gave us two figures who embodied the dual nature of the British Army, the aristocratic warrior and the indomitable common soldier. Commanding the defense was Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell. To look at Macdonell was to see the old warrior spirit of the Scottish Highlands trapped in the rigid uniform of a British officer. He was a younger son of the Chief of Glengarry, a man with the blood of clansmen in his veins. He was a physical anomaly standing well over 6 feet tall, with a frame that seemed carved from Scottish granite. Macdonell was not a philosophical strategist, he was a fighter. He possessed a temperament that was calm in the mess hall but absolutely ferocious when the powder smoke rose. Macdonell represented the archaic concept of noblesse, obliged the belief that because he was born to privilege, he had a moral obligation to be the first into danger and the last out. He did not lead from the rear with a spyglass, he led from the front with a sword. His men feared him certainly, for he was a strict disciplinarian who tolerated no slackness, but they also revered him. They knew that Glengarry, as he was whispered about in the ranks, would never ask a private to endure a hardship he would not suffer himself. In the terrifying isolation of Hougoumont, cut off from the main army, Macdonell's towering physical presence would become the totem around which the entire defense rallied. And then there was the other side of the coin. If Macdonell was the head of the beast, Corporal James Graham was its heart. Graham was an Irishman, a man of simple background but immense character. In the rigid class structure of the 19th century, a man like Graham was expected to be a nameless cog. Yet, Graham was a chosen man, a corporal who had earned his stripes through competence and grit. Graham was described by his contemporaries as a man of Herculean strength. But strength alone is common in the army. What set Graham apart was a quality the British prize above all others: pluck, a quiet, unshakable refusal to be impressed by the odds. In a narrative of the battle, Graham serves as the avatar for the thousands of nameless redcoats who stood their ground that day. He was the quintessential British Inco, grumbling perhaps, cynical certainly, but utterly immovable when the enemy appeared. The relationship between a man like Macdonell and a man like Graham is complex. They inhabited different worlds. In London they would never have spoken. One would be in a carriage, the other opening the door. But on the battlefield the social chasm vanished, replaced by the primitive bond of survival. They understood each other perfectly. Macdonell provided the will, Graham provided the way. When Wellington placed the Coldstream in Hougoumont, he was making a calculated psychological gamble. He knew that the fighting in the farm would be different from the battle on the ridge. On the ridge, men stood in lines, supported by artillery and cavalry, part of a great organism. In the farm, it would be a street fight. It would be confusing, bloody, and intimate. It would require men who could keep their heads when the structure of the battle dissolved into chaos. The Coldstreamers were perfect for this because they were arguably the most arrogant soldiers in Europe. This is not a criticism, it is a tactical asset. When a man believes, truly believes, that he is superior to his enemy, he fights with a different energy. The French might have had the numbers, they might have had the revolutionary zeal, but the Coldstreamers had the absolute, unshakable conviction that a French soldier was naturally inferior to a British guardsman. They viewed the screaming, charging columns of the Armée du Nord not with fear, but with a professional disdain. They were the King's Guard. They did not run. It was simply not done. As they marched down the slope into the valley on the evening of the 17th through the soaking rain and the mud, taking up their positions in the pigsties, barns, and the walled garden of the chateau, they stripped for action. The pristine scarlet tunics were soon stained with wet earth. The tall black bearskin caps, which made them look even taller, veritable giants in the mist, were covered to protect them from the damp. They were transforming a gentleman's country residence into a killing box. And as they worked, Macdonell walked among them, his presence a silent promise that there would be no withdrawal. The orders were clear. Defend the post to the last extremity. In military parlance, this is a polite way of saying die where you stand. There is a haunting gravitas to this moment. These men, huddled in a cold Belgian farmhouse, chewing on wet biscuits and checking their flints, knew what was coming. They could see the campfires of the French army flickering on the opposite ridge, a city of fire stretching to the horizon. They could hear the distant drums beating the assembly. They knew that when the sun rose, the full weight of Napoleon's anger would fall upon this tiny patch of ground. Yet there was no panic in the ranks of the Coldstream. There was only the quiet sharpening of bayonets and the low murmur of conversation in the dialects of England, Scotland, and Ireland. They were the breakwater, they were the iron wall. And as the dawn of the 18th broke, grey and wet, the men of the Coldstream Guards stood ready to prove that their motto was not a boast, but a prophecy. Nulli secundus, second to none, and, as the French were about to discover, second to death alone, to the untrained eye. The Chateau of Hougoumont was nothing more than a rustic curiosity, a sprawling complex of brick and timber huddled in the valley bottom. It was a gentleman's residence, complete with a walled garden, an orchard, a great barn, and a chapel, surrounded by the verdant, rolling farmland of Brabant. It was a place designed for harvest and prayer, not for slaughter, but the Duke of Wellington did not see a farm, he saw a fortress. He saw a breakwater against which the tide of the French Empire must be shattered. To understand the carnage that was about to unfold, one must understand the cold, geometric precision of Wellington's mind. The Iron Duke was a master of the defensive battle, famously preferring to hide his main force on the reverse slope of a ridge to protect them from artillery fire. But a line on a ridge is vulnerable to being outflanked. It requires anchor strong points that jut out into the enemy's territory, disrupting their formations and channeling their attacks. Hougoumont was the anchor for the British right. Standing roughly 500 yards forward of the main Allied line, it acted like a pistol pointed at the temple of the French advance. Its strategic value was absolute. As long as the British held the chateau, the French could not sweep around the right flank to roll up Wellington's line. Nor could they safely ignore it and march past, for the garrison would pour enfilading fire into their backs. It presented Napoleon with a devil's alternative: ignore the farm and bleed, or attack the farm and waste precious time and manpower. Wellington banked on the latter. He calculated that the French, driven by their aggressive instinct and the desperate need for a quick victory, would be unable to resist the bait. He intended for Hougoumont to become a sponge, soaking up French brigades, drawing them into a futile siege that would distract them from the main objective on the ridge. But this strategy came with a terrible price tag. For the sponge to work, the men inside had to endure a concentrated fury that defies modern comprehension. Wellington was not merely assigning a defensive post, he was issuing a death sentence. The orders given to Lieutenant Colonel Macdonell were chilling in their brevity. Defend the post to the last extremity. In the lexicon of the British Army, last extremity is a phrase that carries a heavy finality. It means there is to be no retreat. It means that when the ammunition runs dry, you use the bayonet. When the bayonet snaps, you use the butt of the musket. When the musket shatters, you use your fists. It means you die where you stand, so that the army behind you might live. The position itself was a deceptive trap. While the high brick walls of the garden and the stout masonry of the buildings offered cover, the complex was dangerously isolated. Once the battle began, the corridor of open ground connecting the farm to the main British line would become a kill zone swept by French artillery. Reinforcement would be difficult, if not impossible. Macdonell and his Coldstreamers, along with their Scots Guards colleagues and the Nassau Light Infantry in the woods, were effectively being cast adrift in a sea of enemies. And what a sea it was! Massing opposite them, concealed by the rye fields and the morning mist, was the I Corps of the Armée du Nord, commanded by General Reille. But more dangerously, the division tasked with clearing the wood was led by Prince Jerome Bonaparte, the Emperor's youngest brother. Jerome was a man of immense vanity and limited military talent, desperate to prove himself worthy of the Bonaparte name. He viewed Hougoumont not as a tactical obstacle, but as a personal stage. He did not want to merely mask the position, he wanted to conquer it. He wanted to present the keys of the chateau to his brother as the first trophy of the day. Wellington had counted on this vanity. He knew that Jerome would feed battalion after battalion into the grinder, escalating a skirmish into a catastrophe. The disparity in numbers was grotesque. Inside the complex and the immediate grounds, there were perhaps 500 to 2,000 Allied troops. Facing them were nearly 13,000 French infantrymen, supported by the terrifying power of the French artillery batteries. The math was suicidal. The French had the numbers to simply swarm over the walls like ants devouring a carcass. As the morning of the 18th dragged on, the tension inside the farm became palpable. The rain had ceased, but the air was thick with damp and the smell of wet wool. The Coldstreamers worked feverishly to fortify their tomb. They barricaded the heavy gates with farm carts, harrows, and piles of timber. They smashed loopholes through the garden walls, creating firing positions that would allow them to sweep the fields. They built platforms in the courtyard so they could fire over the rim of the walls. Every officer, every sergeant, every private knew the geography of their peril. To the south lay the wood, a dense tangle of trees and scrub that would allow the French to approach almost unseen. To the north lay the hollow way, the supply road. To the east and west, open killing grounds. They were in a box. Macdonell inspected the defenses with his characteristic stoicism. He knew that the structural integrity of the farm was their only hope. If the walls were breached, the numerical superiority of the French would end the battle in minutes. The defense relied entirely on the discipline of the guards to maintain a rate of fire that would create an illusion of greater numbers. They had to become a machine. Load, present, fire, withdraw, load. There is a specific kind of loneliness that descends upon a forward post before a battle. You can see your friends on the ridge behind you, safety tantalizingly close, yet you know you cannot go to them. You are the sacrificial pawn. The veterans of the peninsula, men with faces weathered by the Spanish sun, checked their flints and looked to their officers. They saw Macdonell's calm, granite jaw. They saw the giant Corporal Graham testing the weight of a musket. And they settled into that grim, fatalistic resolve that is the hallmark of the British infantryman. Wellington had made his fatal calculation. He had spent the lives of the Coldstream Guards to buy the safety of his right flank. He had wagered that a few hundred men in a brick farmhouse could stop a Prince of France and a corps of veterans. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. At 20 minutes past 11, the silence of the morning was shattered, not by a trumpet, but by the roar of the French great battery. The ground shook. And from the edge of the woods, the first skirmishers of Jerome's division stepped out into the light, blue greatcoats stark against the green rye. The waiting was over. The breakwater was about to be tested. The avalanche had begun to slide. At approximately 11:30, the uneasy stillness of the Belgian countryside was annihilated. It began with the deep, guttural roar of the French six-pounders, a sound that rolled across the valley like thunder, signaling the commencement of the slaughter. But the true horror did not begin with the artillery, it began with the trees. To the south of the chateau lay a dense wood, a sprawling tangle of tall trees and thick undergrowth, flanked by an orchard and bordered by heavy hedges. In the sterile diagrams of military textbooks, this was merely cover. In the reality of 1815, it became a claustrophobic abattoir, a green hell where the rigid lines of 19th century warfare dissolved into a savage primal brawl. As the smoke from the first cannonade drifted lazily on the damp air, the wood suddenly came alive. From the French lines, a swarm of blue-coated skirmishers, the voltigeurs, detached themselves and sprinted for the tree line. These were the wasps of the Grand Army, light infantrymen trained to fight in loose order, to use every stump and ditch as a fortress. Behind them, marching to the beat of drums that rattled in the chest, came the solid columns of Jerome Bonaparte's division. 6,000 men, bayonets fixed, stepping off into the rye with the singular purpose of sweeping the British from the earth. Inside the woods, the defense initially fell to the Nassauers and the Hanoverian Jägers, German troops in green and blue, allies of the British Crown. They fought with a desperate courage, their rifles cracking sharply in the gloom of the canopy. But the sheer weight of the French advance was terrifying. It was not a battle of maneuver, it was a hydraulic press of human bodies. The French poured into the woods like water flooding a cellar, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible. The fighting in the wood was distinct from the rest of Waterloo. On the ridge, men died in ranks, cut down by cannonballs or swept away by cavalry. In the wood, death was intimate. It was a war of ambush and knife work. The dense foliage broke up the formations. Officers lost control of their companies. It became a series of isolated, vicious duels fought at point-blank range. A musket barrel protruding from behind a beech tree, a flash of powder, a scream, and a body slumping into the wet leaf litter. The air grew thick with the acrid, sulphurous taste of black powder, hanging in the branches like a ghostly fog, obscuring vision until the enemy was mere feet away. General Riel had intended this to be a diversion, a feint to draw Wellington's reserves. But Prince Jerome, consumed by his dynastic arrogance, fed more and more men into the grinder. He sent in Baudouin's brigade, then Soye's. The wood became a magnet for death. The sound of the musketry was described by survivors not as individual shots, but as a continuous tearing sound, like a piece of canvas being ripped apart by a giant hand. From the walls of the chateau, Colonel Macdonell watched the tree line with a heavy heart. He could see the flashes of the muskets retreating closer and closer. The Nassauers were being pushed back, step by bloody step, by the sheer mass of the French infantry. The breakwater was being eroded. Realizing the danger, the call went out for the Coldstream. This was the moment the guards stepped into the inferno. Moving out from the relative safety of the farm buildings, companies of the Coldstream and the Scots Guards advanced into the orchard and the wood to stem the tide. They moved with that eerie silent discipline that was their trademark, fixing bayonets as they marched. The collision was horrific. The guards, towering men in scarlet, met the French voltigeurs amidst the apple trees and the elms. There was no room for tactical brilliance here. It was a bludgeoning match. The Coldstreamers used the bayonet with ruthless efficiency, clearing sections of the wood in sudden, violent counterattacks. But for every Frenchman they skewered, two more seemed to materialize from the smoke. The enemy was everywhere, firing from the treetops, crawling through the ditches, surging through the gaps in the hedges. The sensory overload was total. The screams of the wounded, trapped in the undergrowth and trampled by the advancing columns, mingled with the shouts of "Vive l'Empereur" and the guttural curses of the British brave. The ground, already soft from the night's rain, was churned into a bloody paste. It was a scene of utter confusion, where the only certainty was the man next to you and the enemy to your front. But courage, even the iron-hard courage of the household division, cannot defy mathematics forever. The French numbers were simply too great. Slowly, inexorably, the redcoats were forced to give ground. They did not run. A guardsman does not run, but they backed away, firing, reloading, and stepping back again. They were trading space for time, selling every yard of the orchard for a pile of French corpses. The retreat through the orchard was a masterclass in rearguard action, but it was a retreat nonetheless. The perimeter was shrinking. The French sensed victory. Their drums beat faster, a frantic driving rhythm that urged the infantry forward. They pushed the British out of the woods, then out of the orchard, driving them back towards the high brick walls of the chateau itself. By noon, the situation was critical. The green hell had been lost. The French controlled the approaches. The Coldstream Guards and their allies were forced to slip through the heavy gates and the small postern doors, sealing themselves inside the farm complex. The open battle was over. The siege had begun. As the last heavy oak door was barred and the last breathless guardsman took his place on the firing step, the complexion of the battle changed instantly. The French burst from the tree line, thousands of them, flushed with the success of clearing the woods. They saw the brick walls of Hougoumont rising before them, not as a fortress, but as the final obstacle to their prize. They did not stop to form lines. They did not wait for orders. Caught up in the frenzy of the assault, the French infantry surged forward across the open strip of ground separating the woods from the walls, screaming for blood. They were a tsunami of blue crashing against the red brick. Inside, Macdonell and his men caught their breath. They were now isolated. The ocean of enemies had surrounded their island. The walls were high, yes, but the enemy was legion. And amidst the smoke and the chaos, unseen by the defenders on the south wall, a group of determined French pioneers, led by the giant Legros, was circling the perimeter, axe in hand, looking for a weak point. They were heading for the north gate. The trap was set. The forest had been a slaughterhouse, but the courtyard was about to become a tomb. By early afternoon on that grey, rain-sodden Sunday, the Battle of Waterloo had devolved into a series of disjointed, bloody vignettes. But nowhere was the situation more desperate than at the perimeter of Hougoumont. The Coldstream Guards had performed miracles in the orchard, trading space for blood, but the sheer hydraulic pressure of the French advance had forced them back behind the brick walls of the chateau. To the casual observer, or perhaps even to the anxious Duke of Wellington watching from the ridge above, it might have appeared that the farm was now secure. The British were inside, the gates were barred, and the red brick walls were bristling with musket barrels, spitting death at any Frenchman foolish enough to cross the open ground. It looked like a fortress. But in warfare, as in architecture, a structure is only as strong as its weakest point. And while the Coldstreamers were manning the southern walls, holding back the main assault with disciplined volley fire, a catastrophe was unfolding on the blind side of the battle. General Riel, commanding the French corps, and Prince Jerome, stung by the humiliation of the woods, had realized that a frontal assault against the garden walls was nothing but a method for suicide. The walls were too high, the British fire too withering. But the chateau was a large, sprawling complex, and like a pack of wolves testing a cornered stag, the French infantry began to circle. They flowed around the flanks of the farm, moving through the smoke, seeking an opening. They found it on the northern side. Here, facing the British lines, lay the north gate. This was the chateau's jugular vein. It was the service entrance, the route through which ammunition carts and reinforcements from the ridge had to pass. Because it faced away from the enemy, it was less heavily fortified than the southern approaches. It was a wide, arching gateway, closed by heavy wooden doors and protected only by a hastily erected barricade of loose timber and farm debris. Crucially, the French forces that had swept around the western flank elements of the 1st Light Infantry were no longer facing the impenetrable garden wall. They were now in the British rear. They had cut the lifeline. The defenders inside Hougoumont were now technically surrounded, an island of red drowning in a rising blue sea. Leading this flanking maneuver was a figure who has since passed into the dark legend of the battle, Sau's Lieutenant Legros. We met him briefly in the opening movements of our story, but it is here at the North Wall that he steps fully into the light of history. Known to his men as l'Enfonceur the Smasher, or the Enforcer, Legros was a giant of a man, a sapeur of the old guard type. We must pause to appreciate the terror a sapeur inspired in 1815. These were the combat pioneers, the hardest men in an army of hard men. They were granted the privilege of wearing full beards and carried great leather aprons to protect themselves from splinters and sparks. Their primary weapon was not the musket, but the heavy felling axe, razor-sharp and balanced for destruction. Legros, seeing the north gate, did not see a barrier. He saw an invitation. He rallied a squad of his fellow pioneers, immense men, axes in hand, and a mass of infantry shouting, "Vive l'Empereur!" They did not stop to fire. They charged. Inside the courtyard, the noise would have been apocalyptic. The defenders were occupied firing over the southern walls, their attention fixed on the orchard. They were deafened by their own musketry, blinded by the thick sulphurous smog of black powder that trapped itself within the courtyard. They could not see what was happening behind them. The first warning was the thud of iron on wood. It was a sound that cut through the rattle of gunfire, a heavy, rhythmic chopping. Legros and his pioneers had reached the gate. They were hacking at the timber with a manic fury. The wooden panels, aged and seasoned, began to splinter. The hasty barricade behind the doors groaned under the assault. In the history of warfare, there are moments where the outcome of a battle, and perhaps the fate of nations, balances on the edge of a knife. This was such a moment. The British defenders nearest the gate, a mixture of Coldstreamers, Scots Guards, and Nassauers, turned in horror. They saw the wood of the gate shivering. They saw the blades of the axes punching through, gleaming in the chaotic light. They rushed to reinforce the barrier, but it was too late. With a final, sickening crack that sounded like the breaking of a ship's mast, the lock shattered. The heavy crossbar, battered and weakened, gave way. The doors did not just open, they burst inward, flung wide by the press of bodies outside. The scene that followed was the stuff of nightmares. Through the breach stepped Legros, axe in hand, roaring triumph, and behind him the dam broke. A torrent of French infantry poured into the courtyard. General Cubières, a French officer of immense gallantry, actually rode his horse through the shattered gate, urging his men forward. The sanctuary of Hougoumont had been violated. By every established rule of military science, the battle for Hougoumont should have ended right there. We must understand the psychology of the breach. For a soldier in a fortified position, the walls are his world. They are his armor. As long as the wall holds, he feels a sense of invincibility. But the moment the enemy appears inside the perimeter, that psychological armor disintegrates. It is the shock of the unexpected. The enemy is no longer over there, he is here, in your home, behind you. In the Peninsular War, at battles like Badajoz and Ciudad Rodrigo, once the British stormed the breaches, the French garrisons often collapsed into panic. It is a primal instinct when the wolf is in the fold, the sheep scatter. The breakdown of order is usually instantaneous. Command and control vanish. Men drop their weapons and surrender, or they flee blindly, seeking any escape from the terror in their midst. As the French flooded into the cobbled courtyard of Hougoumont, firing wildly, bayoneting the defenders nearest the gate, they fully expected the British to rout. They expected to see the redcoats throwing down their muskets. They expected the farm to fall within minutes. After all, how could a few hundred men stand against a breach that was widening by the second? The French were screaming their victory cry, a terrifying, guttural roar that signaled the kill. The smoke in the courtyard swirled, thick and choking. Through the gloom, the blue uniforms of the French seemed to be everywhere. They were fanning out, seizing the outbuildings, taking positions to enfilade the defenders on the walls. The British officers, Macdonell among them, were suddenly faced with the ultimate military catastrophe, an enemy in the rear. From the ridge above, Wellington watched the smoke rising from the farm. He saw the movement of the French columns swirling around the north side. He would have known, with the cold certainty of a master tactician, that the gate had been forced. He would have known that his anchor was dragging. If Hougoumont fell now, the thousands of French troops pinning it down would be released. They would surge up the hill. They would join the main assault. The integrity of the Allied line would shatter. For the men of the Coldstream Guards standing in that courtyard, time seemed to slow to a crawl. They looked at the open gate. They looked at the giant legros and the flood of enemies pouring in. The stench of imminent death was overpowering. It was a situation of impossible hopelessness. They were outnumbered, outflanked, and their fortress was broken. In any other army, on any other day, this would have been the end. The white flag would have been raised. The history books would record a gallant defense that ultimately succumbed to overwhelming numbers. The name Waterloo would perhaps be remembered only as a tragic defeat, the day the ogre reclaimed his throne for good. But the French had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed that the men inside the farm were normal soldiers, governed by the normal laws of fear and self-preservation. They had forgotten that they were fighting the household division. They had forgotten that they were fighting men for whom the concept of surrender was a foreign language, a linguistic impossibility. Instead of panic, there was a strange, suspended moment of clarity. A realization that rippled through the ranks of the guardsmen, from the lowest private to the colonel himself. The gate was open. The enemy was here. And therefore, the enemy must be killed. The shock of the breach did not shatter the Coldstream. It crystallized them. But as the French numbers in the courtyard grew from 10 to 30 to 100, the window for salvation was closing with terrifying speed. The fatal wound had been inflicted. The heart of the British defense lay exposed, beating frantically beneath the ribs of the brick walls. And as Legros raised his axe to signal the final charge that would wipe the defenders out, the world held its breath, waiting for the massacre to begin. Hope, it seemed, had finally abandoned the Chateau of Hougoumont in the annals of military history. There are battles won by the genius of generals, by the sweeping maneuvers of cavalry, or by the cold precision of artillery. But the Battle of Waterloo, and by extension the fate of Europe, was saved in a span of perhaps 30 seconds by the raw brute strength of fewer than a dozen men. The north gate was wide open. The French were pouring through. The psychological dam had burst. In the smoke-choked courtyard, the air was electric with the screams of the dying and the triumphant roar of the French sappers. To any rational military mind, the position was lost. The iron wall had been breached, and the floodwaters of the French Empire were rising fast. But Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell was not a rational military mind in that moment. He was a force of nature. He was a Highlander, a man whose ancestors had fought with broadswords in the glens of Scotland, and as he looked across the courtyard and saw the disaster unfolding, a switch flicked in his soul. He realized with a terrifying clarity that there was no tactic, no maneuver, no order that could save them now. There was only physics. The gate was open. It had to be shut. He did not waste breath on a speech. He did not look for a bugler. He bellowed a single command that tore through the din of battle, a command that was more of a primal roar: close the gates. And then Macdonell did the unthinkable. He did not wait for his subordinates to obey. He lowered his sword, dipped his shoulder like a bull charging a matador, and sprinted directly into the heart of the French advance. He was not alone. In the chaos of the melee, a handful of men saw their colonel move and instinctively followed. They were a disparate band of heroes, united only by the uniform they wore and the desperate urgency of the second. There was Captain Henry Windham, a man of immense courage. There were Ensigns Gooch and Hervey. And there was Sergeant Graham, not the Corporal Graham we met earlier, but his brother-in-arms, and of course the giant himself, Corporal James Graham. These men, perhaps 10 in total, threw themselves against the tide. To understand the ferocity of this moment, you must strip away the pageantry of war. This was not fencing. This was a barroom brawl fought with the destiny of nations as the stakes. The French sapiors leading the charge were massive men, swinging their axes with lethal intent. The British officers and sergeants crashed into them with the violence of a collision at sea. Swords rang against axe blades, fists struck jawbones. Boots trampled the fallen into the slick, bloody mud of the courtyard. They fought their way to the doors, but getting there was only the beginning. The French were still surging against the opening from the outside, a pressing weight of hundreds of bodies shoving against the panels, desperate to widen the gap. The doors themselves were heavy, iron-bound oak, designed to keep out thieves, not armies. Now they were heavy with the weight of history. Macdonell, Windham, and the Grahams threw their shoulders against the wood. Imagine the scene. On one side of the timber, the elite shock troops of Napoleon, screaming for victory, pushing with the momentum of an entire corps behind them. On the other side, a handful of exhausted guardsmen, their boots slipping on the wet cobblestones, their lungs burning, pushing back with every ounce of strength they possessed. It was a contest of pure physical power, a rugby scrum of death. For a heart-stopping eternity, nothing moved. The doors trembled, caught in the equilibrium between the irresistible force of the French and the immovable object of the Coldstream. Macdonell, his face contorted with effort, veins bulging in his neck, roared for one final heave. Corporal Graham, utilizing his Herculean strength, planted his feet amidst the carnage and drove his shoulder into the panel. Slowly, agonizingly, the gap began to close. The French outside, realizing their prize was being snatched away, redoubled their efforts. Bayonets were thrust through the narrowing gap, stabbing blindly at the defenders. Captain Windham, pushing near the edge, reached out to secure the door and had his arm slashed by a French soldier. But he did not let go. He could not let go. To let go was to surrender England. With a grinding shriek of hinges that sounded like a soul in torment, the heavy doors swung inward. The gap shrank from a yard to a foot to an inch. The light from the outside world was extinguished, replaced by the gloom of the courtyard. But the danger was not over. The doors were shut, but they were not secured. The pressure from the outside was immense, a living battering ram of French infantry pounding against the wood. The British defenders were holding the panels in place with their own bodies, human bolts straining against the flood. "The bar!" Macdonell screamed. "The bar!" The great crossbar, a heavy beam of oak used to secure the gate, had been knocked loose in the initial breach. It lay on the ground, buried somewhere in the mud and debris. Corporal Graham, displaying a presence of mind that borders on the miraculous, spotted it. In the crushing press of the melee, he stooped, his massive frame a target for the Frenchmen still trapped inside the courtyard. He heaved the heavy timber up, ignoring the chaos around him. With a grunt of exertion that might have been heard on the ridge above, Graham slotted the beam into the iron brackets. Thunk! The sound of that wood dropping into place was the most beautiful sound in the history of the British Army. It was the sound of a lock turning. It was the sound of salvation. The gate held. The French outside pounded on the timber, fired their muskets into the wood, and screamed their frustration. But the iron wall was whole once more. Inside the courtyard, the silence that followed the dropping of the bar was momentary, but profound. Macdonell, chest-heaving, uniform torn and muddied, looked at the men around him. They were battered, bleeding, and gasping for air, but they were alive. And more importantly, the farm was secure. They had done the impossible. They had reversed the flow of a river. They had physically forced the genie of revolution back into its bottle and capped it. But as the adrenaline of the exertion began to fade, a new and grim reality settled over the courtyard. The gate was shut, yes, but not all the French were outside. Trapped inside the walls with the Coldstreamers were nearly 100 French soldiers, the vanguard of the assault who had made it through before the doors slammed shut. Among them was the giant Sow's Lieutenant Legros, the man who had axed the gate open. These Frenchmen were now cut off. They were isolated in a cage with the lions. They looked back at the closed gate, the gate that was their only exit, their only link to the Grande Armée, and saw the massive figure of James Macdonell and his men standing guard over the bar. They turned to face the courtyard and realized with a dawning horror that they were not the conquerors of Hougoumont. They were its prisoners. The dynamic shifted instantly from a desperate defense to a ruthless extermination. The Coldstream Guards, having come within a heartbeat of annihilation, were in no mood for mercy. The adrenaline that had fueled the closing of the gates now curdled into a cold, lethal rage. The sanctity of their regiment had been violated. Their officer had been forced to fight like a common brawler. The feat of Hercules was over. The miracle had been achieved. But now, the debt had to be paid. The Frenchmen trapped inside gripped their weapons, knowing that there would be no quarter given and no quarter asked. The courtyard, so recently the scene of a heroic struggle, was about to become a slaughterhouse. And as the eyes of the Coldstreamers turned from the closed gate to the trapped enemy, the air grew heavy with the promise of violence. The closing of the gates was an act of salvation. What followed would be an act of vengeance the moment the great oak bar thudded into place. A strange, suffocating silence descended upon the courtyard of Hougoumont. It was not a silence of peace, but the indrawn breath before a scream. The roar of the battle outside, the pounding of the French fists on the wood. The shouts of the frustrated infantry seemed to drift away, muffled by the heavy timber. Inside the wet cobbled square, the world had shrunk to a few hundred square feet of lethal intimacy. Trapped within the walls were nearly 100 soldiers of the Artillerie Légère. A moment ago, they had been the vanguard of victory, the tip of the Emperor's spear thrusting into the heart of the British position. Now they were castaways. They looked at the closed gate, then at the high walls bristling with redcoats, and finally they looked at the men blocking their exit. They saw Lieutenant Colonel Macdonell chest-heaving, his sword dripping with rain and blood. They saw Corporal Graham, a giant in his own right, his face a mask of granite resolve. And behind them, turning from the loopholes and the barricades, came the rest of the Coldstream. There is a specific psychological phenomenon that occurs when elite troops realize their sanctuary has been violated. It is a transition from disciplined defense to a cold, predatory rage. The French were not just enemies, they were intruders. They were in the wire. And for the Coldstream Guards, whose identity was forged in the fires of discipline and exclusivity, this was an affront that could only be washed away with blood. There was no demand for surrender. In the heat of 1815, amidst the smoke and the adrenaline, the chivalry of the officers' mess did not extend to a breached perimeter. The French knew it. Sau's Lieutenant Legros, the axe-wielding giant who had smashed the gate, gripped the haft of his weapon. He looked around at his men, fierce veterans, sapeurs with leather aprons and hardened eyes, and he saw the end written on their faces. There would be no prisoner exchange here. There would be no parole. The engagement that followed was not a battle. It was an execution. It began with a single shot, perhaps accidental, perhaps impatient, and then the courtyard erupted into a chaotic, swirling melee. The Coldstreamers did not form lines. They did not wait for orders. They fell upon the French with the ferocity of a pack of wolves defending their den. Muskets, too slow to reload in the frenetic scramble, became clubs. The heavy brass butt plates crashed into skulls with sickening force. Bayonets, the cold steel so beloved by British infantry doctrine, did their grim work. It was a fight of inches, of breath hot on the face, of boots slipping in the bloody mire of the farmyard. Legros L'Enfonceur did not die easily. History records that he fought with the desperation of a trapped animal. He swung his axe, the tool that had almost won the day for France, in wide, lethal arcs, keeping the redcoats at bay. He was a warrior of the old school, a man who would not fall until he was overwhelmed. But against the sheer number of guardsmen, even his immense strength was finite. A bayonet thrust, a pistol shot, a blow from a musket butt, and the giant fell. The man who had held the fate of Europe in his hands lay dead on the wet cobblestones, his axe slipping from his fingers. Around him, his men were being systematically dismantled. The French fought bravely. They had nowhere to run, but they were fighting men who were masters of close-quarters violence. The Coldstreamers moved with a ruthless efficiency, clearing the courtyard corner by corner, wagon by wagon. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid stench of powder smoke that clung to the damp ground. The noise was horrific, not the thunder of cannons, but the wet, ugly sounds of hand-to-hand combat. The grunt of exertion, the snap of bone, the gurgling cry of the dying. It was a massacre, pure and simple. The guards were methodically erasing the mistake of the open gate. They were ensuring that no enemy soldier who had set foot inside their fortress would live to tell of it. And yet, amidst this orgy of violence, amidst the red mist that had descended upon the defenders, there occurred a singular, jarring moment of humanity, a moment that illuminates the strange, contradictory nature of the 19th century soldier. As the guardsmen swept through the courtyard, bayoneting the wounded and finishing off the survivors, they cornered a small figure near the stables. He was a French drummer boy, a mere child, perhaps no older than 15, dragged into the war by the insatiable demand of the Napoleonic conscription. He stood there, terrified, clutching his drumsticks, surrounded by the towering giants of the Coldstream, men with blood on their hands and murder in their eyes. By rights, he should have died. In the heat of a massacre, age is rarely a shield. But as the bayonets were raised to skewer him, a shout went up. A hand was stayed. Perhaps it was an officer. Perhaps a sergeant. History is vague on the name, but the order was given. Not the boy. In the middle of an abattoir, where mercy had been suspended, the Coldstream Guards lowered their weapons. They spared the child. He was taken prisoner, ushered roughly but safely into the depths of the chateau, the only Frenchman to enter Hougoumont that day and live. It serves as a stark, poignant counterpoint to the carnage, a flicker of civilization in the heart of darkness. It reminds us that these were not monsters, but men pushed to the very edge of human endurance, capable of extreme brutality and sudden, inexplicable grace. But for the rest of the French detachment, there was no such grace. The slaughter continued until the last blue coat lay still. The courtyard, which had been a bustle of logistical activity only an hour before, was now a carpet of corpses. Nearly 100 French soldiers lay dead, their bodies piled against the walls, draped over the wagons, or sprawled in the mud. The silence returned, heavier now, laden with the weight of the dead. The Coldstreamers, chests heaving, wiped their bayonets on their trousers. They looked at each other, eyes wide and hollow, processing the adrenaline dump. They were alive. The farm was theirs. Macdonell, injured but standing tall, surveyed the scene. He knew there was no time to mourn, no time to celebrate, and certainly no time to rest. The knocking on the gate had resumed. The French outside, unaware that their comrades had been annihilated, were still trying to force an entry. The artillery was starting to pound the walls again. "Man the walls!" The order was hoarse, practical. The guardsmen stepped over the bodies of the men they had just killed. They climbed back up to the firing steps, they picked up their muskets, and they began to fire. The iron wall was back in place, the breach had been cauterized, but the psychological toll of the courtyard massacre was profound. It hardened the defenders. They had looked into the abyss, they had felt the breath of defeat on their necks. They knew now that there would be no relief. They knew that the French would not stop coming. The battle for Hougoumont had shifted from a tactical engagement to a personal vendetta. The Coldstreamers were no longer fighting for the Duke, or for the King, or for the map of Europe. They were fighting for the patch of bloody ground beneath their boots. And the French, realizing that their sneak attack had failed, realizing that the gate was shut and their vanguard swallowed whole, felt a shift in their own resolve. Frustration turned to fury. If they could not take the farm with bayonets, they would burn it to the ground. They would turn Hougoumont into a funeral pyre. As the afternoon wore on, the sky above the farm began to darken not with rain, but with the black, oily smoke of a new terror. The howitzers were being wheeled into position. The incendiary shells were being fused. The massacre in the courtyard was over, but the inferno was just beginning. The fury of the French assault had broken against the gates of Hougoumont, but the hate that fueled it remained undiminished. General Rieux and Prince Jerome, staring through their spyglasses at the stubborn brick walls that had swallowed entire battalions, realized that the direct approach had failed. The iron wall could not be smashed by men alone, and so, with a cold, ruthless logic, they decided that if they could not capture the fortress, they would incinerate it. The order was given to the artillery. The French howitzers, squat, ugly beasts designed to lob shells in high arcing trajectories, were wheeled forward. Their crews, stripped to the waist and blackened with powder, adjusted their elevation screws. The first shells crashed through the slate roof of the main chateau and the great barn. There was a dull thud, followed by the crackle of dry timber igniting. The farm, centuries old and seasoned by endless summers, was a tinderbox. Within minutes, wisps of gray smoke were curling from the eaves, quickly darkening into thick, oily plumes that blotted out the sun. Inside the complex, the atmosphere shifted from the sharp terror of combat to the suffocating horror of a burning trap. In any other army, the natural, overwhelming instinct of a human being inside a burning building is to flee, to run, to seek fresh air. The fear of fire is primal, it overrides training, rank, and duty. But the Coldstreamers did not run. As the roof of the chateau began to collapse, sending showers of sparks and burning debris onto the men below, the sergeants barked their orders. "Steady, lads! Watch your front!" The men stood their ground. It was a display of discipline so rigid, so absolute, that it defies modern comprehension. They were willing to burn alive rather than disobey an order to hold the post. But the true horror of the inferno lay not with the fighting men, but with the wounded. The great barn had been used as a makeshift field hospital. Dozens of men, Coldstreamers, Scots Guards, Nassauers, and French prisoners lay on the straw, their limbs shattered, their bodies broken. As the fire spread to the barn, a nightmare unfolded. The flames licked up the wooden partitions. The straw caught. The smoke rolled in, thick and suffocating. The wounded, unable to move, began to scream. It is the darkest moment of the battle, a scene of such gothic horror that even the most hardened veterans wept to recall it years later. Many of the wounded were dragged to safety by their comrades, pulled into the open air of the courtyard or the gardener's house. But the fire moved too fast. The heat was too intense. Many could not be saved. To let the French in was to lose the battle. It was a moral calculus of agonizing cruelty. The few had to be sacrificed for the many. Lieutenant Colonel Macdonell moved through this hellscape like a spectre. His face was blackened by soot, his uniform torn. He directed the defense with an eerie calm. When the flames threatened to consume the entire position, he made the critical decision to abandon the main house and the barn, pulling his men back to the sturdy, open-air walls of the garden and the courtyard. But they did not retreat from the farm. They simply consolidated within the ruin. The roof of the chateau collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of sparks high into the gloom. The interior was a furnace, but the outer shell, the brick perimeter, remained. And manning that shell, silhouetted against the raging orange backdrop of the fire, stood the Coldstream Guards. To the French soldiers watching from the woods, the sight must have been terrifying. The chateau was gone, reduced to a hollow, burning skeleton. And yet, from every window, from every loophole, the redcoats were still firing. The British seemed to be demons, impervious to fire, fighting from within the very mouth of hell. The smoke from Hougoumont became a landmark for the entire battlefield. It drifted up the ridge, choking the main British line, a grim signal fire telling Wellington that his right flank was burning. But crucially, the signal also told him that the flank still held. As long as the smoke was rising, the guards were there. The fire raged for hours. It consumed the chapel, scorching the feet of the wooden Christ on the crucifix above the door, a detail that the superstitious soldiers would later claim was a miracle, as the fire stopped just at the statue's toes. It turned the beautiful country estate into a blackened, smoldering wasteland. But the fire failed as a weapon. It failed because it could not break the will of the men it was meant to destroy. The Coldstreamers treated the flames as they treated the French cavalry or the artillery, as just another hardship to be endured with stoic resentment. They wrapped wet rags around their faces, they shared their canteens, they pissed on their musket barrels to cool them down, and they kept firing. By late evening the fire had largely burned itself out, leaving only the glowing embers of the beams and the stone shells of the buildings. The iron wall was scorched, battered, and hot to the touch, but it was still standing. The French had thrown everything they had at this few acres of brick and mud. They had sent their best infantry, their giant pioneers, their heavy cavalry, and finally the cleansing fire of the howitzers, and they had failed. The defense of the burning chateau broke the spirit of the French attack on the right. They realized that these men could not be moved by any power on earth. As the sun began to set, casting long, blood-red shadows across the corpse-strewn fields of Waterloo, the shooting at Hougoumont began to slacken. The French fell back, exhausted, demoralized, defeated by a regiment that refused to die. The Coldstream Guards had held the post to the last extremity. They had stood in the fire and had not been consumed. But as the smoke cleared and the night rolled in, the cost of that impossible stand began to reveal itself. The survivors, deafened, burned, and covered in the blood of enemies and friends alike, looked around at the ruin of the world they had saved. As the sun finally dipped below the bloody horizon of Flanders on that Sunday evening, a strange and heavy silence began to settle over the valley. The thunder of the Grand Battery had ceased. The screams of the cavalry charges had faded. The Battle of Waterloo was over. The ogre, Napoleon Bonaparte, was in flight, his imperial guard shattered, his dreams of empire dissolving into the mist. But at the Chateau of Hougoumont there was no cheering. There was only the crackle of cooling embers and the groan of the dying. The farm was unrecognizable. The lush, verdant estate that had greeted the dawn was now a blackened, skeletal ruin. The walls were pockmarked by thousands of musket balls, resembling the face of a man ravaged by smallpox. The beautiful chateau was a heap of smoldering brick. The chapel was scorched. The orchard was a graveyard of splintered trees and shattered bodies. Yet, amidst the desolation, one fact remained, stark and undeniable: the flag of the United Kingdom still flew. The French had thrown the weight of an entire army corps against this single post. They had burned it, battered it, and stormed it. But they had never taken it. In the cold light of strategic analysis, the defense of Hougoumont emerges not just as a feat of heroism, but as the hinge upon which the history of the 19th century turned. The mathematics of the engagement are staggering. Through the course of the day, nearly 14 French troops, some of the finest infantry in the world, were sucked into the vacuum of the farm. They were pinned down, bled white, and ultimately neutralized by a garrison that never exceeded 3,000 men. Wellington's fatal calculation had paid off. The Coldstream Guards had acted as the ultimate breakwater. Every French brigade committed to the futile struggle for the orchard was a brigade that was not marching up the ridge to break the British center. Every hour, Riel and Jerome wasted trying to crush the iron wall, was an hour bought for the Prussians to arrive. It is no exaggeration to say that without the stubbornness of James Macdonell and his men, the Battle of Waterloo would have been lost before the Prussians ever fired a shot. But history is more than maps and numbers. It is written in the character of men, and the legacy of Hougoumont is best enshrined in a story that unfolded years after the smoke had cleared. A patriotic English vicar, the Reverend John Norcross of Framlingham, was so moved by the miracle of Waterloo that he left a substantial bequest in his will. It was a sum of money to be awarded to a single individual. The terms of the will were simple yet daunting. The money was to be given to the bravest man in England. The executors of the estate, faced with an impossible choice in a nation filled with war heroes, turned to the one man whose judgment could not be questioned, the Duke of Wellington. They asked him to name the recipient. Wellington did not hesitate. He did not choose a general who had led a sweeping charge. He did not choose a flag-bearer or a spy. He wrote back with a name that by then was whispered with reverence in the mess halls of the household division. Lieutenant Colonel James Macdonell of the Coldstream Guards. In the Duke's mind, the closing of the North Gate was the singular act that saved the army. But when the executors approached Macdonell to present him with the title and the fortune, the Scotsman stopped them. In the gesture that encapsulates the very soul of the British regimental system, Macdonell refused to accept the award. He told them that he could not, in good conscience, claim to be the bravest man in England. He argued that the closing of the gate was a two-man job. He insisted that the sheer physical strength and indomitable spirit of his partner, Corporal James Graham, had been the deciding factor. Macdonell declared that he would only accept the bequest if it were split equally between himself and the corporal. It was a moment of supreme honor. An aristocrat, a high-ranking officer, bowing his head to share his glory with a ranker, an Irishman, a common soldier. It spoke to the bond forged in the fire of the courtyard, a bond that transcended class, rank, and station. They were no longer officer and subordinate. They were the men who had held the door against the dark. Corporal Graham, for his part, accepted his share with the quiet dignity of his breed. He did not squander it. He eventually retired from the army, a living legend within the ranks, and spent his final years as a Chelsea pensioner. When he died, he was buried with full military honors, not as a general, but as the bravest of the brave. Today, if you travel to the battlefield of Waterloo, the landscape has changed. The Lion Mound dominates the ridge, a tourist trap of stairs and statues. But if you walk down into the valley, away from the crowds, you will find the farm. It has been restored, brick by loving brick. You can walk through the orchard where the Coldstreamers died in the tall rye. You can stand in the courtyard where the massacre took place. And there, set into the northern wall, are the gates. They are not the original timber, those were lost to time and rot, but they stand in the exact same spot. When you stand before them tracing the grain of the wood, it is impossible not to feel the weight of what happened there. You are standing on sacred ground. You are standing at the exact geographic coordinate where the ambition of Napoleon was finally checked by the stubbornness of the British soldier. It is said the ghosts walk the fields of Flanders. But at Hougoumont, the presence is not one of haunting but of vigilance. The spirit of the Coldstream Guards seems to permeate the very mortar of the walls. It serves as an eternal reminder of a time when the world was saved not by a committee, or a treaty, or a drone strike, but by a few terrifying seconds of muscle and will. The Coldstream Guards, the Iron Wall, they proved that day that there is no force on earth, no emperor, no army, no fire that can move a man who has decided not to move. They taught us that when the odds are impossible, when the gate is broken and the enemy is pouring in, the answer is not to flee. The answer is to dig your heels into the mud, lower your shoulder, and push. Their legacy is not just in the history books, it is in the DNA of the British Army. It is in the refusal to yield. It is in the quiet, unspoken understanding that when the order is given to defend to the last extremity, it is not a metaphor. It is a promise. As we leave the charred ruins of Hougoumont and the brave men who sleep beneath its soil, we are left with the enduring image of Macdonell and Graham, shoulder to shoulder, straining against the weight of the doors, frozen in time, forever closing the gate on tyranny, forever standing guard over the liberty of Europe. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the storm. If this story of forgotten valor stirred something in you, if you believe that the memory of these men deserves to be kept alive, then please subscribe to the channel and share this history. Until we meet again on another battlefield, remember, history is not the past. It is the ground you stand on.